Welcome to another episode of MMT Mondays. In the decade leading up to the American Civil War, the nation was bitterly divided over the issue of slavery. Southern states viewed the right to own another human being as their God-given right. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens explained this belief in his infamous Cornerstone speech, so this was following the formation of the Confederacy. He stated slavery and white supremacy was the cornerstone of the new Confederate States of America. Even the northern states were largely silent on the issue due to the immense profit that they were making from the inhumane Southern institution. During his first inaugural speech, President Abraham Lincoln, who is known as the Great Emancipator, was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect the institution of slavery in the South just because he wanted to prevent the outbreak of war. During that time, it was easy both politically and morally to turn a blind eye to the evil of slavery with the excuse of it being a necessary evil. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts stood out as an example of someone who refused to turn a blind eye towards this injustice. Sumner and the radical Republicans became champions for not only ending slavery, but for ensuring full equality before the law and the redistribution of land for the formerly enslaved. On May 22, 1856, a few days after Charles Sumner gave his famous anti-slavery speech, Crime Against Kansas, he was beaten so badly in the Senate chambers by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks that he could not return to office for 3 years. A friend of Charles Sumner stated in his eulogy that when he asked him whether he ever considered the other side regarding slavery, Sumner responded, "There is no other side." Besides being one of my personal heroes, the mindset of Charles Sumner towards rejecting compromising with injustice is the stance we must take today when it comes to injustices. We must be honest with ourselves and our children about our past. Only then can we truly learn from the sins too often deleted from written history. Once we have this realization, we will understand Sumner was right when facing injustices. There is no other side. In our first video, we see how Sumner's belief in refusing to compromise with the injustice in his Crime Against Kansas speech nearly cost him his life. Along with highlighting the evil of owning another human being, Sumner also called out one of the lesser discussed aspects of slavery, which was rape culture. Sumner decried the supposed Southern code of gentlemen by calling out the moral hypocrisy that they represented. These bombs that Sumner launched ultimately led to the Southern leadership devising a way to put him in his place in an effort to preserve white superiority.
When Charles Sumner comes to the Senate, they silence him. They don't want him to speak. They prevent him from speaking in the first session he appears in. The Southern senators tell him explicitly he cannot speak on the floor. And Sumner rises in the Senate on May 19th, 1856, to deliver a stem winder of an oration called The Crime Against Kansas. He spares nobody on the other side. There's also a sexual undercurrent because Sumner has made a point, unlike anyone else previously, to point out the rape culture of slavery. And he systematically does it in a public way. He actually pays for and emancipates a slave girl who has what to all appearances is white skin and brings her to Massachusetts to the state legislature to show the complete hypocrisy of slavery, the rape culture, and how they are oppressing women and children.
What I felt reading that section was today we have things that we know are prevalent and widespread, but we don't talk about them in polite company. We don't talk about them on the Senate floor, particularly.
Well, it was not talked about until Sumner in this way. And he was the first anti-slavery senator to break through. When Sumner does that, the Southern senators meet. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can infer. And there's some evidence that I've collected that's in here that they decided that was enough and that he needed to be put in his place physically.
Yeah.
and they went to Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Preston Brooks was a scion of plantation wealth and a screw-up. He had come into the Congress. He was alcoholic. He was very much concerned with his honor, which was a Southern code, and they played upon him and basically pointed him to attack Sumner. He had accomplices who physically marched him there, protected him, prevented others from interfering with him while he was bashing Sumner on the head. And it was, for all intents and purposes, an assassination.
Right.
And Sumner barely survived. We don't know the extent of his brain trauma. He could easily have been killed. And he certainly suffered the effects for years and, in fact, did not return to the Senate for years. The political effects of this are profound. And it's after the whole drama of Sumner's caning that I draw Lincoln onto the stage.
In our second video, the late, great Howard Zinn expounds on the example Charles Sumner set with his explanation of the role history books have played in our nation's willingness to turn a blind eye and take part in injustices. Zinn explains the basic problem with history books is that they are nationalistic and elitist. They approach history as beginning in 1776, and ever since then we have been the guiding light of freedom for the entire world. A truthful history would look at our foreign and domestic policies as expansionist, violent, and militaristic. This has led to countless atrocities and injustices that still continue to this day. The only way to begin to rectify these mistakes would involve being honest about it. Doing this isn't being unpatriotic or un-American, but the exact opposite. Do you think being patriotic means wearing a America shirt and getting drunk on the 4th of July thinking we have never done anything wrong? It's the exact opposite. To be patriotic means to love your country enough to accept the sins from the past in order to build a more just future for ourselves and for future generations. Take, for example, the Declaration of Independence. It states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." We grew up learning that phrase, but did you ever stop to think about it? At the same time Thomas Jefferson was writing that statement, he also owned nearly 200 slaves, and only a few years later, he would purchase the Louisiana Territory from France. This purchase would result in the westward movement of the United States, resulting in the ethnic cleansing of millions of Native Americans, all in the name of manifest destiny. So while this document claimed all men are created equal, we see that wasn't the case if you were enslaved, a Native American, a woman, or a poor white man who didn't own property. Is taking this critical look at our history unpatriotic or wrong, or does it help us gain a better understanding of our history in order to understand how those injustices continue to manifest themselves in our society today?
Well, the basic problem of traditional history books is that they're nationalistic. They're elitist. By nationalistic, I mean that they look upon the world as centered around us, and they look upon American policy as benign. A more realistic and more truthful history would take a look at American foreign policy over the last several hundred years, really. We'll take a look at American foreign policy and see it for what it has been: expansionist, violent, militaristic. In other words, it would be a history that would be honest in a way that we expect individuals to be honest about themselves and their past and to rectify their mistakes. To do this is not to be unpatriotic or un-American, unless you think, that being American means approving everything your government does, or being patriotic means supporting everything your government does. No, being honest about our past, being honest about what we have done in the world, and a history that looks at what we have done from the standpoint of black people, Native Americans, poor people, women, people who have generally been omitted from traditional history. When you look at our history from the point of view of the people at the bottom rather than the people at the top, well, then everything looks different. Policies look different. You have different criteria for measuring what the country does. The leaders don't have such an incentive. The textbook publishers don't have such an incentive. The only people who have such an incentive are the teachers and students and people who are not benefiting from the present system. And so if there's going to be a change in the teaching history, it will have to come from below. And whatever change has taken place so far, and there has been some change in the teaching of history, whatever change does take place will take place because teachers and students begin acting in a different way, reading different materials, moving away from the traditional textbooks, rejecting the no child left behind demands of standardized tests and dates and the old view of looking at history through generals and presidents. And it will have to come from below.
As you can see, we must be honest with ourselves and our children about our past. Only then can we truly learn from the sins of our past. Once we have this realization, we will realize that Sumner was right in saying that in the face of injustices, there is no other side. The same can be said when it comes to looking at how our money works today through the lens of MMT. Once we critically look at how macroeconomics work, we realize everything looks different. You can't unsee it. Just like textbook publishers don't have an incentive to publish a well-rounded view of history, the US government doesn't have an incentive to account for how our financial system works. If they did, then they would have to account for why we don't have Medicare for all, ending student debt, reparations, guaranteed housing, and a thriving wage, among other items that the government can't afford. We, the working class, are the ones who have the incentive to demand the change that we seek. There is hope for change. Just like we see schools moving away from arcane disservices to students such as textbooks, standardized testing, and the BS 1776 Commission, we are also witnessing more and more people discovering MMT. Books like Dr. Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth and Pavlina Chernova's Case for a Job Guarantee are opening millions of people's eyes to how our country's financial system is set up to benefit the few. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications of new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, and Rockfin. Thank y'all, and have a great week.